you need a pretty solid chunk of money to have fun on chain. I think it's really, really important in a space as complex and as much of a dark forest as crypto is to have someone who can show you the ropes and help you understand how things work, how not to get rugged, like all of these things.
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of NEWFORUM. I am super honored to have Chase Chapman join me today. Chase is DAO contributor extraordinaire, contributing at Metropolis, previously a contributor at Forefront and at Index Scoop. Chase is also investing at the Crowd Fund, and she also has her podcast called On the Other Side, talking to people, particularly in the DAO space. In this episode, we'll be speaking with Chase about her background and journey in the crypto world, as well as her insights on the emerging technologies like blockchain that are shaping the digital age. We'll also discuss how we can enhance and maintain user experience and accessibility in Web3, and whether DAOs and digital communities can play a role in preserving human-centeredness and coordination in these decentralized systems. Hey Chase, super excited, super honored to have you on this episode of NEWFORUM.
I am so excited to be here.
So I guess we can begin with how did this all you don't even need any introduction. You're Chase Chapman. That's enough. And I'm sure people are curious to know how you got into the space and just how did it all begin for you?
Yes. I love starting there. So I guess at a really high level, I've told how I got into the space a bunch of times and it always changes, you always meet people at conferences or you're on podcasts and you talk about it. And recently I've actually been starting weirdly at the 2016 election. That's kind of been my starting point. So I live in the US, I grew up in the US, and I am pretty young. I'm Gen Z. And so I sort of have always grown up online. In middle school, I had an Instagram and everybody in 4th or 5th grade was on Facebook. And so, of course, I think for me, a lot of my crypto journey starts in just being digitally native. And then in 2016, seeing the ways that digital spaces with the presidential election in the United States can actually really influence the way that we live our lives. And so I sort of trace back why I'm excited about crypto there. And we can talk a little bit more about that and how it intersects with DAOs and all that stuff. But in 2016, I was in high school, ended up graduating and going to university where I started diving really deep into crypto because I was working in data analytics and sort of marketing. And crypto was actually this very interesting, or I guess the blockchain was really this very interesting solution to a problem that we had around data provenance. And immediately I got excited about use cases outside of what we were thinking about. And so fell down the rabbit hole from there, ended up having a mentor who I started a company with, which was a developer tooling company, graduated and stepped away from that, and then went full into the DAO ecosystem, contributing to DAOs, writing on and thinking about DAOs. And now I'm at Metropolis where we build infrastructure for DAOs. And I also get to work with a ton of amazing decentralized organizations and DAOs. And so that's kind of my journey. There's some random little bits and pieces there we can pull on as strings, but that's where I like to start.
Yeah, I'm ready to pull on some strings. So I know that you mentioned a bit about your mentor, and you co-founded Decentology, and I watched I think it was an interview of you, and you spoke so highly of your mentor and also about your passion for the work you're doing through Decentology. So now I know you're no longer there. I'm just curious, how did that shift happen? And where are you now in that sense?
Totally. Yeah. So when I originally matched up with Nick, my co-founder and my mentor at the time, and still in many ways someone who I look up to, but when I originally matched up with him, we were both really excited about this idea of accessibility in the space. How do we make crypto something that, my grandma could use? That was always my big thing. And what we ended up realizing after building quite a few fun and different products was just that, the developer tooling was really, really tricky and made it hard to build amazing experiences. And so we felt like that was a part of the space that needed a lot of help. And that's where we focused. I think that made so much sense. But ultimately, for me, I'm not technical. I'm not a developer. I learned so much in that process, and I'm so grateful to my co-founder and for that experience. But I also recognized that when I graduated, I think I had this moment of being like, okay, am I going to keep doubling down on the developer experience, or are there other things that are pulling me? And the DAO ecosystem was really bubbling up and was something that I was feeling really drawn to. And of course, like I mentioned, I was graduating, so there was just sort of this weird life transition thing. And that's when I really went like head first into DAOs, which was interesting because I came from this side of the ecosystem that was much more like infrastructure heavy and thinking about the developer experience. And DAOs are definitely like a layer above that, where Seed Club just put out an article a few weeks ago about like DAOs are consumer products, and they are sort of the I wouldn't call them accessible, but they are the experiences that I was hoping one day crypto is able to provide. And so I sort of fell down that rabbit hole and haven't really looked up since.
So obviously, when I think about DAOs, I think about like inclusion, and I wanted to know from a visibility perspective and talking about inclusion in the space, would you say we need more platforms or programs like She 256 with their kind of support structure, and what are other avenues to bring more diversity into the space? Because you talked a bit about how, meeting your mentors through the program really helped you, almost like a handheld into the space, and that was great for your journey, in the beginning. So yeah, if you have any thoughts on that, do we need more of that? And do we even have more of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think without a doubt, if I didn't have a mentor, I would not be where I am now. And if I didn't have Nick as my mentor at the time, I wouldn't be where I am now. And I'm forever grateful for that. I think it's really, really important in a space as complex and as much of a dark forest as crypto is, to have someone who can show you the ropes and help you understand how things work, how not to get rugged, like all of these things. And so to me, I think mentorship programs are deeply important. And I think the other piece here that I always try to keep in mind is like, of course, when I think about diversity and inclusion in the space more broadly and what needs to happen to be a success, like I'm speaking from a very privileged perspective of living in the United States. I have a ton of different identities that give me a lot of privilege when I move through the space. And so I think there are definitely like several layers to this. And I think there are a ton of people who have probably better perspectives on how we can bring in more diversity and inclusion more broadly. But the one thing that I will say, which is not a solution, but it is a point that I really like to like make sure I'm clear on when I talk about any of these things in crypto. There was a period of time, and I think a lot of people still hold the belief that anonymity effectively protects people from discrimination, right? So this idea that like, oh, well, if someone doesn't know that you're a person of color, or someone who's not a cis white man, or like all these things, then like, in theory, people shouldn't be able to discriminate against you. Couldn't be more incorrect. I really don't like when people use that logic. And the main reason is just that like being part of a group that is marginalized in crypto, just because we're building a new system doesn't mean that we're not sort of, what's the right word? Absorbing a lot of the existing structures that keep people from being able to engage, blah, blah, blah. So like an example of this that I love to use is like airdrops, right? Amazing thing. Love it. The problem, and I'm not saying it's a problem with airdrops, I'm just saying this happens, is that like if you don't have a bunch of money, getting airdropped something that's like $5,000 worth of a token, it doesn't make sense for you to keep that token. You're going to sell it. And so there are these really weird structures where I think in crypto, a lot of people design systems and forget that like there are existing structures that stop people from being able to either keep an airdrop or spend 10 hours a week contributing to a DAO that they're not getting paid for, or even these like simple nuances of like weird microaggressions or what it means to have to like really stand up for yourself in terms of compensation. Different groups are going to respond differently to that based on how they're socialized. So I think we need a ton of structures that help uplift people who are women, people of color, like all of these different groups, people in geographic areas that are not the US and Europe. But I think a lot of that is going to need to come from things like mentorship groups and other structures that do work on like uplifting, as opposed to sort of saying anonymity saves all, because that's very obviously not true.
Is Web3 accessible?
That's such a good question. I mean, I guess the obvious answer has to be no. And I'm not even saying it from a perspective of, I'm saying that it in such a broad strokes perspective. I mean, like the usability in the space is definitely not there. We're working on it, but I think we have a long way to go. So there are a ton of things that I think that make that statement not true. And I guess I would say like the top one, which I don't see enough people talking about, and I think we like to tell ourselves in a bear market that this isn't true, but I think it's true still, is just that like you need a pretty solid chunk of money to have fun on chain. Doesn't mean like you can't engage in crypto Twitter. Of course you can do that. But like crypto doesn't really become fun until you have a few grand to play around with. And that's not accessible by any means. And I guess the alternative of that is like maybe it's fun to try to get to a couple grand, but still that's not appealing and accessible to everyone. So I guess I would say no. Do you think it's accessible?
No. I think that what makes it inaccessible in a way, I mean, you touched on really amazing points, right? But I think that there's so much, like the language that we use in the space in itself is not very accessible. And you need to have some understanding of the ins and outs in order to be able to do something. And most of the artists or people, let's say from the emerging market, might not have that, might not have that access. So that in itself causes that inaccessibility.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Tina from Station, I think it was a tweet, but it might have been an article. I don't know where she said it. Maybe she said it on the podcast interview with me. I can't remember, but she had this really good line about like if you look at different niches, they all have their own language, and one of the things that serves is essentially creating in-groups and out-groups, where if you don't know, what rugging means, or you don't know, that's a very simple one, but if you don't know what like all these weird complex, if you don't know what a liquid staking derivative is, which is people call LSDs, like you're not in the in-group. And it kind of reminds me of the whole like energy that was around like Bored Apes and the bull market and all that stuff, where it was just like if you're in, you're in, and if you're out, whatever. So yeah, I think even at the level of something like crypto Twitter, that's really interesting. And then of course, when we think about what that means for people to come into the space and actually participate, to your point, that's like a non-starter when you can't even understand what people are talking about. It's just, you're never going to get anywhere.
Totally. And I want to know your thoughts on, because, we're talking a bit about like inclusivity, diversity, and I think one of the beauties or the beauty of DAOs is how it enables, I guess, like coexisting, collaboration, innovation with a diverse group of people, right? And I mean, like, I can't imagine, like, you've been a contributor within several DAOs, and I can imagine how it's like coordinating a room full of very diverse people, and like when it comes to this decision making and, voting and like, how does this, any thoughts on that? Like, how does that go down? Does it affect execution? Does anything get done? Like, what is the current state of that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Whether or not anything gets done in a DAO and the failure to get things done, I think is usually more a result of not being able to coordinate and organize around some democratic system, more so than it is people who are not able to see from each other's point of view, though there are definitely some interesting elements. I mean, Index had a pretty wide range of geographic contributors within a ton of different areas across the globe. That was fascinating to watch. And they actually had a group that was supporting, I forget exactly what region it was, but it was like it was a very specific group aimed at making sure that contributing to Index was accessible for people, I believe specifically in Asia and like the Pacific Islands, sort of like, I can't remember what it's called. I'm trying to remember. But anyway, that was fascinating to see, where you actually had this sort of like coalition of people who were saying, hey, we're contributors. We are part of Index, and like meetings are at really inaccessible times and all these different things. And so I think structures like that helped to sort of make sure that people weren't just being sort of like left behind. Because again, defaulting to like American and European time zones was a really big challenge. But I don't know. I don't know if this is really I don't know if this is a something that I've experienced too deeply, which I guess speaks to also like, maybe we don't have the most diverse group of contributors in DAOs. But anyway, I feel like I've definitely had some experience with it, but I would say I'm by no means A, an expert on it, and B, I don't know if I've had enough data to know what works and what doesn't, and how that's gone.
I mean, it's good to hear your perspective, because this is what you do, on a daily basis. And I would love to also talk about the human side of Web3. Would you say that DAOs like encompasses that? And I know like there's a quote that you like by Brian Flynn, and it says in Web3, does empathy exist more or less than Web 2? And so I'm just curious, like, does the decentralized and community-driven nature of Web3 lead to more empathetic experiences, or do the technical complexities and distance between users like hinder empathy in this new paradigm?
Ooh, this is such a juicy question. I'm going to attack this from a weird angle. I think that what we're starting to see, and what my hope is for Web3 more broadly, is that we start to create more democratic spaces online. So when I think about why it matters that I grew up on the internet, and why the 2016 election matters, and why all of these, and by that, I really mean like Cambridge Analytica and everything that happened with them using data with Facebook and all that. What that really like feels like to me is that it's become clear that you basically have to be on Instagram and, Facebook, I mean, Facebook to a lesser degree, but like TikTok and all these things in order to be a member of society that's like understanding what's going on in the culture and all this stuff. Like, I went on a Hinge date a few weeks ago, and before we went on the date, the person was like, what's your Instagram? I want to make sure you're not a serial killer. Like that, which is totally normal behavior, right? Like,
Yes,
we have no choice but to be in digital spaces. And so the way that I approach things, and the way that I think Web3 fits into all this, is that we don't have a choice to whether or not we want to be on these platforms. We should at least have a say in how they're governed. And so to me, that's where like Web3 and the sort of like democratic digital space thesis comes into play. What's interesting is that at a platform level, it's like pretty unclear how TikTok is going to become more democratic, right? Like when Instagram changed their logo a few years ago, everyone was so mad. I don't think a DAO would have voted yes to that. And it was probably a good move on their part. So there's an interesting tension there. So I'm not sure how this is going to work at a huge platform level. But when we think about how this works out in digital spaces that we exist in, that are a little bit more like local, quote unquote, I think what this is ultimately going to end up looking like is like these smaller democratic systems. And so I think when I can't remember what the exact number is, but I think the optimal like democracy is between like 8 and 15 million people or something like that. It's like not huge. So I say all of that to say that I think if we're going to start to see the localization of these spaces, because we acknowledge that democracy at like a massive scale is probably not what we want, what I think is going to end up happening with these smaller democracies, and the reason that I think smaller democracies work so well is because instead of having like representatives that are responsible for the voices of 5 million people, you instead have many representatives who are potentially tasked with or trusted by their constituents to advocate for their unique perspectives. And so all of that comes back to empathy in the context where I think what's so hard about scaling huge democratic systems, partially, is that empathy is just like lost. Like me to any politician in the United States that's sitting in the Senate, not understanding how we're empathizing with each other. Like in theory, yes, but in practice, I think it's actually much harder. And so I think there's a hope for me, and this might be kind of a convoluted way of moving around this, but there's a hope for me that in localizing these spaces and giving people a voice, you actually do start to build capacity for more empathy, partially just because you're reducing the distance between you and the people that are like either representing you or the people on the other side of a specific debate or whatever it might be. And so I guess from that perspective, I think my hope would be that we actually do have more empathy and we're able to practice that. I don't know if that would work out in practice. Of course, it's hard to say, but I think there's an interesting element there.
I mean, I love the passion, as you went down there, it was just coming. And I think this is really important, very important to talk about this, because like empathy is so important and we just cannot afford to lose that. I know you spoke about like these democratic, like small, like local communities, and I'm like curious to know how that connects to DAOs. And would you say that like, have you come across any maybe like a perfect human-centric DAO model that reflects this in any way?
Yeah. So I guess on the perspective of these like smaller groups, I think to me, the label DAO is mostly just helpful for describing how people organize. Like it's really hard to talk about what I was describing in the terms that I was describing. Like the amount of setup that I just had to give to describe it is a perfect example of that. But to me, all of those smaller localized groups are DAOs. They're like distributed or decentralized. They are like an organization of people. There's some group. Autonomous, I'm still, the jury's out to me on what that really means in practice. But I think that those things are DAOs. In the question around the perfect DAO, I think anything with humans is going to be pretty messy. And I actually think that I think that there are lots of mechanisms that are interesting and working within DAOs and outside of DAOs. But I think part of what is so fascinating about DAOs is actually that there is never going to be a perfect structure or a perfect organization. There is just a least problematic, least frictionful experience. Because whenever you involve humans in anything, it's going to get messy and chaotic and there's going to be tension. And so to me, I think a lot more of what matters is figuring out how do we learn from and constantly evolve within these iterations of the structures that we've created, such that, when that tension does rise or when there is some friction, we're able to take a step back and say, okay, I'm feeling this way. How can we work through that? And I guess to me, that's also the ultimate empathy, version of empathy, right? Is being able to look across the, computer screen at someone else who you're, beefing in the forums with and say, okay, clearly something's happening here. How can we work through this together?
Yes, and I mean, I would say you are such a great example of that because we first communicated like I'd never seen you'd never seen me, and we were texting via Twitter, and I could feel so much like empathy and just so much kindness, and I didn't know I could get that from it was like really amazing. And yeah, I first of all, I thank you for that. And so yeah, and I guess
I love that.
my follow-on question would be, I mean, we've touched a little bit on that, but how can like DAOs lead to greater socioeconomic benefits, and what are some of the strategies that can be employed to achieve this goal?
Yeah, I mean, I think the overarching like argument that my brain immediately goes to is the idea that ownership is, of course, very powerful. And for the most part, in digital spaces in particular, the people who create the value on these platforms are not the ones who are deriving the most, at least economic benefit. And I would say in a lot of cases, probably social benefit as well, depending on your relationship with platforms, right? Like there are times where I feel like I'm getting a ton of benefit from Twitter, and other times where I feel like Twitter is sucking so much life out of me and I need to get off of the platform. So I think from an economic perspective, the hope around DAOs would be that by empowering people to be owners, we're at least able to take a shot at minimizing the amount of value that's being extracted from participants on platforms. I think something that, and I'll go into the social side, and then I want to come back to that because there's something interesting there. On the social side, I think when you do that and when you do distribute ownership, there's a hope that in a perfect world, by giving participants on a platform the opportunity to govern that platform, you actually start to, again, minimize the amount of extraction that's coming from these platforms. If I had to say, TikTok would have a hard ban, like, because you can not a ban, sorry, I'm using the wrong terminology, a hard limit on the amount of time that you can spend a day on it. So like right now you can say, I only want to spend 20 minutes on the app. But once you spend 20 minutes on the app, they say, enter your code. I don't want them to do that. I want them to just completely stop me. But they don't do that, of course, because that doesn't make sense for their model. And so I think, like, in theory, you might have users choosing better practices and things like that. In practice, we'll see how that actually works out. So more broadly, I think that's where we're going to start to see a better balance of both economic and social benefits of these platforms. The one thing that I will say on the ownership piece, circling back to the economic side, David Phelps published an amazing piece called Bailout Brink a couple of weeks ago about the way that money impacts us as people and has this like real impact on our lives that I think, we like to call like money is imaginary to some degree, right? But like it also has this very real impact on our lives. And it's just an amazing piece. And anyone who hasn't read it, like immediately, that's what you should do. But he had this great line in the piece, which was like, I'm totally paraphrasing it incorrectly, but it was basically like, maybe the point of crypto is not to make everyone a bunch of money. And so I've been thinking about that a lot because it's easy to say, like, when everyone becomes owners, economic benefits will be distributed. And I think to some degree that's true. But I also think if people continue to make a bunch of money in crypto and we still aren't seeing that type of distribution, or maybe even if we are seeing the distribution of ownership, but we still have these weird aspects where people could just get like crazy rich off of really dumb shit, like maybe we haven't been doing our jobs this whole time. And maybe instead ownership doesn't need to have a price tag on it. And like the way that we think about, the economics around ownership needs to change. I know that's a very broad and kind of random side note, but I think there's something really interesting about like crypto is not like a get rich quick for everyone. Instead, it's like a small group of individuals shouldn't be able to get rich quick off of everyone's backs, basically.
No, that's great, Chase. I think you are gonna get people listening to you think, and I think that's why we have these conversations, because we need to be challenged. We need to get out of our comfort zones and think, and then, innovate better, because you said something about wherever humans are, there's always some complexity. So if we don't touch on these topics, then how do we think about, how do we fix it? It starts with a conversation. I'd love to hear, what would you say, what's the difference between collective intelligence and social sensitivity?
So I think there's actually a very interesting dynamic here, which is that they're people from the Ready, which is like this sort of consulting organization that helps typically companies become more self-organizing, but they are also dabbling in like the DAO ecosystem, and I really, really respect them. So Aaron Dignan and Rodney Evans are sort of I don't want to say at the head because they're not hierarchical, but they're the public voices and faces of it. And I've had lots of conversations with them. And one of the things that they have always said, and this is something that I've talked with Rodney about, is that when you are in a self-managing organization, which is kind of like a DAO, it's like decentralized, it's just that you don't have like a boss and stuff like that. Pretty much everyone needs to have a therapist, because you in environments like that are going to get a ton of feedback, because you don't have a boss to sort of protect you from or tell you that you need to do certain things, your work isn't up to par, whatever. Everyone's just telling you it. You're getting all this data from everyone, or from the different people that you work with. And the reason that matters to have a therapist is because if you actually want to like take those inputs and transform yourself with them and leverage them to create something better, you need to have both, I think, like a deep sense of empathy for yourself and for other people, but you also can't be so destabilized by that feedback that like, your identity is in shambles and you don't know who you are and your work sucks and all these things. And so I think that when I think about what it means to amplify collective intelligence and have this element of like social, like ability to sense yourself and other people and all this stuff, what I think it really looks like is a very interesting dance between understanding where someone comes from when they're giving you a piece of feedback, challenging your beliefs, whatever, having empathy for them and for yourself, and also not making it mean something about who you are as a person. And I think that is the only way to actually amplify collective intelligence, because collective intelligence, quote unquote, is truly, it comes out of you and I having a conversation, sharing thoughts, challenging each other. Because if we're just like agreeing with each other, nothing collectively comes out of like a homogenous, agreeable conversation, other than if you're like challenging each other a little bit or stepping up, something where you have some like tension that you're playing with. And so, yeah, I think from that angle, it's a super interesting question. And I think it very much comes down to this idea of like being both understanding for other people and yourself, and saying, I'm not going to let my ego come in and make this something about me and my worth and my value.
Yeah, that's really important, especially, working most of the time, working remotely. And I'm telling you, I've probably not met some of my teammates, and, you get to like just communicate online and just text. And I think it's very important what you're touching on. I wanted to ask I had a question about mental health, but I'll leave that to the end. My next question is about a quote, actually, Steph from Seed Club. You touched a bit about them. And she tweeted that DAOs are not the future of work, they're social networks and consumer experiences. What do you think?
I love Steph and I love Seed Club. I think this is a fascinating take. And Seed Club also published that piece that I mentioned earlier, called, I think, DAOs are consumer products, I think is what it's called. I think I'm in a 50% agree and 50% disagree, but I'm not disagreeing with the point that's being made there. I think the DAO, well, that's not even true necessarily. I think the DAOs are probably potentially also the future of work. Like, I do think that that's very feasible. Mm-hmm. I think that DAOs as consumer applications, though, is a much more interesting, exciting, and expansive way to think about them. And so when I talk about something like, hey, our digital spaces should be, collectively governed and more democratic. At the end of the day, that's a consumer experience. To the degree that like the American government is a consumer experience, I get on the subway every day and I consume it, and to some degree, like that is provided by the American government. So I think that there's definitely an interplay there. I think more of what they're speaking to is things like FWB and the FWB app, which I think is absolutely phenomenal. I think it's a lot easier to get people to wrap their head around more democratic spaces when they are digital, especially because like it's really hard to understand what that means for work and all these things. Of course, work is now digitally native in a lot of ways, but I think it's a little bit more complex. But yeah, I think it's a very good take. And I also do think that DAOs are probably the future of work, because it's hard to imagine a world in which like most of our consumer experiences shift towards this more democratic DAO-like model, and somehow work doesn't end up there.
No, yeah, I think that makes sense. I think it's going to probably be like a 50-50 situation, and like just depending on the context, because for me, I see that DAOs, it's like the future of digital communities, because digital communities have always existed, right? But DAOs add this element to it. And so I can definitely see it being like elements of it being adopted in a way in the future of work. And I also want to ask, so you had posted, there was a tweet of yours that said it was very it was a very technical space, but there were all these promises that crypto were going to change how humans exist in digital spaces. And I want to know like what was going through your mind. I'm sure probably you don't remember maybe when you posted this, but like I have quite a few of your tweets, your quotes. So I wonder what was like going through your mind. And yeah.
Yeah, I think I think this was in some thread about my evolution in crypto, or something reflecting on what crypto has promised and where it's actually delivered. I think that crypto has really led with infrastructure. Like we have built Ethereum and Bitcoin and these like core infrastructure layers, which are required to build any experiences on top of them. But that does definitely lead to pretty technical conversations. I've even noticed like in the bear market, there are a lot more people talking about the infrastructure than the applications on top. And I think with that, when you dream about what could be built on infrastructure, you make tons of promises about what's possible and what could happen and all this stuff. And that's great and exciting, and it's necessary to build those things. However, crypto hasn't fully fulfilled those promises yet, partially because we just haven't had the time to experiment. We haven't necessarily had all of the tools required for experimenting. Like a lot of this stuff is really interconnected where, you can build an amazing application, but if the wallet problem is not solved, you have this cold start problem no matter what. And so I think for me, a lot of this comes back to the idea that as an ecosystem, we have a long way to go when it comes to experimenting with more of these like consumer applications. But again, like back to this idea around DAOs or consumer experiences, DAOs or social experiences. I think that's a really exciting model for how we can think about this stuff. And I think the more that we can build experiences that are interweaving this idea of ownership and like social experiences, the better, because we start to create value outside of economic, number go up type of mechanisms. And instead, we were able to focus more and center more of these like unique human experiences, like connection, like sharing, your life. Like the FWB app is so fascinating for this reason, because it is just people posting their lives. And it feels really like a cozy little community. And it's just like, it's fascinating.
You said people like posting their lives. I just thought about like content creation and like in our digital age where like content creation is often driven by the need for external validation and engagement, how can creators find balance and create content that serves their own mental health and well-being? And how can we prioritize the personal value of creation over its value as a commodity for others? And maybe would you say ChatGPT is, like to some extent, it's kind of impacting people's writing skills and appreciation for writing?
I tweeted about this yesterday because I was thinking about how ChatGPT really makes me appreciate why I write. Especially in a world like you're talking about where there's all of this pressure to create content for other people to consume. ChatGPT makes it so easy that it reminds me that like, oh, I write for myself, I write for my own sanity, not because I want to create for other people. And if other people find that interesting or helpful or they hate what I have to say, like that's all fine because I create for my own meaning and fulfillment and sanity and all that stuff. And so I think there's like a really, and I wouldn't call myself like a creator to the extent that so many other people are. So I would be very curious how other people who like really are deep in this world think about it. But my initial thought on a lot of this stuff is that I think that the advent of and the ease of just like creating anything with AI, whether that's art or writing or video or whatever, or podcasts for that matter, I think really does bring us back to like, why are we doing this? And for the last, I would say 10 to 20, I guess 10 years mostly, with social media, I think the reason that we create has been so like obfuscated through these layers of addiction loops with social media and all of these things and monetization of your content as a creator and all that. And I think we're finally getting back to the point where we're going, okay, if any AI can generate pretty much any of this stuff, why am I still doing it? And it's funny because I stopped tweeting for a while, and the thing that I realized was that forcing myself to come up with one thought per day, even if it was stupid and a meme or whatever, was so helpful in not only me feeling fulfilled in my work, but also in feeling inspired to continue the work that I do. And so I came back to Twitter and I was like, oh my God, I forgot that formulating a thought every day is just deeply valuable for my soul. So anyway, I say all of that to say, I think that a lot of this stuff, at least in my experience, has the potential to bring us back to the reason that we create in the first place, which really is never for the consumption of anyone other than, our own brain. And even then, I don't think it's for our own consumption. I think it's a totally different thing.
Yeah, great points. And on the topic of like AI content creation, I'd love to hear more about your podcast on the other side and what's inspired it. Like, what's the vision? What's the mission with that?
Yes. It was originally inspired because I hated Twitter for a while. This was before I ever started tweeting. I was like, I'd been in crypto for a while, but I just kind of ignored Twitter. And Brian Flynn, who you quoted earlier on empathy, is a friend of mine, and he was like, Chase, you got to start making something. You can't keep thinking about crypto all the time and not tweeting. But you like talking, so you should start a podcast. And I was like, maybe. And so I kind of like mulled it over for a while and ended up launching the podcast. And I always am grateful and give him credit for pushing me to do that. And the main reason that I started it was just because it felt like people weren't talking about the human experience around Web3. Some people definitely were, and there was a lot of really valuable discussion happening. But it felt like a lot of like to me, when I look back at, how we got to where we are with Web 2, I think a lot of it is just like not considering really critically how the systems we were creating could impact us. And So when I think about like the introduction of the like button, like obviously had a massive impact, and that probably wasn't even something that they intended or anticipated. And I think the same goes for having like liquidity of everything. Like there are just these weird things in Web3 that we're creating that are patterns that I'm not sure we're going to be super happy with. And so a lot of my goal around the podcast was to kind of create space for like, what does this whole world look like on the other side of Web3 adoption? That means like the good, the bad, the ugly, the amazing, all of that. And that's kind of where the podcast started and where I think it still stands today. It's gone through some fun, I think, transitions and definitely diving into like the DAO ecosystem, because that's what I think about and work on a lot. But I think at the end of the day, it's very much intended to be like a human-centric way of thinking about a lot of these things. Because I think we just tend to ignore that. Other than sci-fi books, I guess I'm not into sci-fi books, but I feel like sci-fi books give us an idea of what could happen if everything goes wrong. But there's a disconnect between that and practice.
You're totally right. And I think that's one of the things that we are also super focused on with NEWFORUM. Chase, before I let you go, I would love to know what do you do in terms of like mental health? Like you are so busy. You are doing so much. So how do you manage your mental health? And then I think the last part of it would be, what keeps you going in Web3? Why haven't you quit?
I love these last two questions. On the mental health front, I've always been a big morning person. I have my morning routines. So I recently got into breath work, which I would 11 out of 10 recommend. If anyone wants to get into it, there's an app called Othership. So like other and then ship. Very good. And then I do my little journaling. And I'm also, this is empty because I just got a new notepad, big to-do list person. That's my big thing. And then and also limiting Twitter consumption. Been really working on that one. I go back and forth. I'm like pendulum swing. So that I would say is my mental health thing. And surprisingly, tweeting every day, actually very helpful in the mental health realm. Weird, but like I mentioned before, it feels, I don't know, like it keeps me inspired. And then what keeps me going in Web3, I really think it's this vision for like a better version of the internet. I've always felt deeply involved with, and sort of like the internet was always an important part of my life, and also kind of trapped in the internet. And I think if I felt that way, I can't even imagine what kids now feel. And so for me, a lot of it is just about like, how do we build systems that acknowledge that that's probably inevitable? Like we can't just undo that, but create a system that is better and that does give people more of a say in the spaces that have become such an important part of our lives.
Wow, I love that. I don't know what else to say after that, but that's super important because, I mean, there's that saying, if you can't beat them, you join them. And the living online, in a way, it's like it's happening. And so it's important, like you said, like the infrastructure, the ethical side of things, safety, security, privacy. Someone told me, if you want to protect your privacy, just don't go online, just like go off the grid completely, because there's no way, like no press, once you're online. But maybe that's true. Maybe Chase, you're gonna inspire how this can be solved. But yeah, really, thank you so much for your time today. I've been absolutely looking forward to talking to you. So this was such an honor, and I love your insights and everything. And so yeah, before you go, if you have any last thoughts, and then maybe you can tell our listeners and community where they can find you on your social platforms. Twitter for sure, but maybe somewhere else.
Yes. Boy, I don't know if I have any last thoughts. I guess just one closing thing, and I don't know, when people who are listening to this got into the crypto space, or if people are starting to get in, whatever part of like your journey you are in, I think we're at a really interesting time in the space where things are calming down a little bit. And I think this is where finding your like reason for being here, whether it's like some of what I was talking about or something totally different. Everyone has, I think, a really unique and special reason for being here. And even if that doesn't feel clear, like I think everyone's drawn to the space for a reason. And so even if you aren't able to articulate it, I think there's something really, really fascinating about like nurturing that seed. And And then where you can find me on Twitter, I'm at Chase R Chapman. I have my podcast on the other side, which you can find at othersidepod.xyz. Yeah, I think that's most of where I exist.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chase. And we will have all the links in the description below. Thank you all for listening to us today. And if you want to get more involved in our community, make sure to follow us on our social platforms. Twitter, it's NEWFORUM_NCO. And we will have all our other links, including our Discord link in the description. And yeah, thank you all. And take a moment. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And I will see you in the next episode. Thank you so much, Chase. This was amazing.
Thank you. This was so wonderful.